today. Look, the clamor to get in is solely a reflection of the popularity, hardly of me, but of our guest, Dan Senor. The first person I really want to welcome, though, is all the way from Jerusalem. We have Dan's mother, Helen Senor.
I did not put him up for that. She's going to think I put him up there. He just asked me about it.
So, look, Dan, everybody's got an ambition in life. One of my ambitions is to one day here on the Call Me Back podcast, Dan say, and one of my good friends, Jeff Feig, because it seems like everybody...
Longtime friend.
Longtime friend.
I used to always say old friend, and like 2 or 3 people pointed out that it sounded like I was being ageist. So I now say longtime friend, which then lets their guard down.
So Dan is obviously the host of the very popular podcast, Call Me Back. Before that, it was called Post-Corona. He works for Elliott Capital Management, where he's the head of public relations and corporate governance, and does a whole bunch of other things. He's on the board, I think, of the Singer Foundation. He's been an advisor to presidential candidates. He's done debate prep. He worked in Iraq for the U.S. forces, for the coalition, and he is most importantly on the board of Heschel, and we count on him at every opportunity all right, so I'm going to dig right in, Dan, and I'm going to start at the end, not at the beginning. Seared into my memory on October 7th is this picture of Noah Argamani being taken away in distress, being jeered and being booed, and utter fear on her face, and this sinking feeling like, where is Israel? Where are our soldiers? And then I'm listening to your latest podcast today, and another picture comes up, and it's a picture at the Tel HaShomer Hospital of Noah Argamani walking out of a helicopter into the arms of her father, who is saying, "Look at our army, look at our army." Between the person that you interviewed on this podcast, Nadav Eyal, and your other contacts, and you mentioned Avi Yisharov, you know a lot of the inside story of this amazing, dangerous, risky caper. Could you tell us about it?
Wow. First of all, it's wonderful seeing everyone here. Thank you. I'm grateful that I got in. It's a little stressful. I made the mistake about 5 minutes ago of running to the bathroom before we came up here, and it was like, it was intense. It's quite an event you put on here, Jeff. I think there's a lot to say. I interviewed Nadav Eyal, who's one of, I'd say, the 2 or 3 most dialed in Israeli journalists, national security Israeli journalists, columnists, analysts in Israel. Let's just say when I interviewed him, which was early Sunday morning, we refer in the conversation repeatedly to, based on senior officials he's speaking to, he had spent the night before with literally the most, you couldn't say their names in the podcast, but the most senior officials who were involved in planning the operation. I guess I had a few reactions to that conversation. First of all, I thought, a lot of the reporting at that point that had come out about the operation were about these isolated pieces of, there was all kind of piecemeal reporting. There was this white truck and it was moving down a road, and then somehow the gears got jammed, and there would be an article in the Times of Israel about that. Or there were these little pieces, and no one, at least in the English language press, had literally just walked through how the operation was planned, why it was planned, what the key decisions that were made when they were in kind of go, no-go decision-making mode, and then kind of what happened step by step by step. And so that's what I asked Nadav to do in that conversation. I just kind of let him go. What struck me about it was, one, even though I kind of knew the story because I had been speaking to him through the weekend and I'd spoken to Avi Yisharov, and the reason Avi Yisharov is relevant is because he's the co-creator of Fauda, and he's very dialed in with the whole Duv Devan crowd, and the Duvdevan crowd was very involved with this operation because, they went in as undercover, as Palestinians. I mean, undercover, the cover was Palestinian, so they were very central to the operation. So he actually had a lot of interesting sourcing.
Talk about the moving truck.
Yeah, well, so what I want to say, I think the few points about this was, that I came away from this conversation was, one, there were so many decisions that had they gone, that the decision makers in the war cabinet had to make, had they gone 1 inch in a different direction, this thing would have been a catastrophe. I mean, that's what blew me away, is it was, and when I say catastrophe, meaning hostages probably dead, and the addition of new hostages to the total number, which is to say Israeli soldiers being captured. That was the risk, and it so could have, it so easily could have happened when you kind of go through all the decisions that they had to make. That was one observation. The second observation I would say is there's something so Israeli about so much of this story. One is we constantly hear about how the war cabinet members are at each other's throats, personally, politically, and they are. And then you're also reminded that they're Israeli. And they really have this sense of national purpose that even when they're at each other's throats, all the personal animosities get subordinated. So you may recall on Thursday, or Wednesday, I can't remember when now, Benny Gantz had announced he was going to be holding a press conference on, I guess it was Saturday night, or I think it was Saturday night, and I guess it was after Shabbat, or he's going to be delivering a statement. And Gallant and Netanyahu were keeping him posted on the planning of this operation. Ultimately, it was really just Gantz, it was just Gallant and Netanyahu that were planning the operation. And then when they decided that the operation was a go, but he had already announced that this was the press event, so he and Netanyahu agreed that he would continue with saying this announcement was going to happen. Now, everyone knew that the announcement was he was leaving the government, and then Netanyahu put out a statement saying he was going to hold a press event to respond to Gantz's statement. Meanwhile, they both know both events are going to get canceled, and they just wanted to project. And literally, I had when we were planning the podcast for Sunday, we assumed the podcast for Sunday was going to be about Gantz leaving the war cabinet, and Gantz and Bibi were in cahoots, planning this,
Just trying to screw up your press.
Most importantly, they're messing with my podcast planning, and it's a friend of mine sent me a note after. Nadav talked about this in our conversation. A friend of mine who lives in New York messaged me and said, we're buying an apartment in North Tribeca, this guy and his wife, and we're buying it from a couple that is in the middle of getting divorced. And all along, we thought, well, this is going to be very helpful because they're we're negotiating with them, but they're at each other's throats, and we can kind of play them off each other. It's great. And then they quickly realized that even though they were in this bitter divorce, they were totally unified in screwing the buyers of the apartment. And it was like a wake-up call. And that's how I feel about Gantz and Bibi planning the dueling press conferences, even though they both know neither was going to happen. That was the second thing. The third thing that blew me away about it was in the lead up to the decision to do it, to conduct this operation, apparently Gallant and Herzi Halevi, the IDF chief of staff, had sent the leadership, the security leadership had been coming to Halevi and Gantz with this plan, and they kept sending them back. No, we're not coming to try this. And the level of granularity that guys like Gallant and Gantz and Halevi can weigh in on when they're making these decisions. Certainly Gallant in this case, and to some degree Netanyahu. Their level of knowledge, the granularity of that knowledge about this will happen where, and they know the geography, and they know the topography, and you just don't see that among political leaders anywhere in the world, that they could actually override their military commanders or the military officers planning this just based on an incredible level of detail and experience. And then the two last points, when you listen to Nadav Ayel in this episode, he was so clearly moved by the whole thing. So he's, I get a mixed reaction to Nadav on the podcast. Some people love him, some people don't love him. Some people think he's sometimes a little too gratuitously critical of the government. I think he's less gratuitously critical than many of the other Israeli journalists. But what you hear, even with his cynicism about Israeli politics, he was screaming with pride. And he told so many stories about how he was so genuinely moved by the reaction of Israelis to this, to why Israel needed this, to his sort of disgust with the world's reaction to it. I mean, he really goes through, like, he was laughing at the end of the conversation in disgust about how the international press was reporting the Hamas data on the number of Palestinian civilians that were killed in this operation, so that were the story. And he said Hamas, if you read the Palestinian Telegram channels, they were putting out that lie. They were also putting out that it wasn't the IDF that conducted this operation, it was the US Delta Force, because they were humiliated that the IDF pulled this off, so they wanted it to be that the Delta Force had done it. And they had put out that 18 Israeli soldiers had been killed, and they had all these things that they put out. And of course, he said that the international media didn't report on any of those other lies. The only lies is if you're gonna use their data about how many, then use all of them. Say that the Delta Force did it, and so there was that. On the one hand, he was this reporter, and the other, he was so like offended by the whole thing. And then he read this letter from his father describing a military operation that he'd been involved in 40 years ago. And it was a very moving letter, and he compared it to the way the leaders of this operation felt about this operation. And like I said, only in Israel are these journalists, yes, they're journalists, and yes, they're incredibly scrutinizing about Israeli politics, and yet they're participants in the national project of Israel. They are participants. They're not just observers, they're not just analysts, they live it. And they're proud of their participation in it. And he makes a passing reference to how the military censors, he had some detail that he wasn't supposed to report, and he checked with the military censor, and he's totally coordinated with the military censor. If you had an American or British journalist talking about having to deal with military censors, their like heads would explode. It would turn into some like Orwellian, and he just thought it was perfectly reasonable because he's a participant, he's a stakeholder, he's not just an observer.
Yeah, and just talk for a minute about the way he describes why it's so important to the soldiers that this happens, what it says about, and I recently had a debate with someone who was very sympathetic to the other side, who kept saying, look, all lives are equal. And the only thing is, we put a very high value on life. That's what we saw with the Shalit deal, which a lot of people regret. And he speaks about the importance of that to the soldiers. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a controversial topic because I think there's growing debate about which I don't think is really relevant to the rescue operation, which is to say, there is growing debate. I mean, I know personally a member of the War Cabinet who once asked family members of one hostage who were really pushing for Israel to make very generous concessions to Hamas. And this member of the War Cabinet, I'm just leaving names out of here, this member of the War Cabinet said to these family members, he said, if you could go back in time to 2011, where our government, Netanyahu, released 1,027 Palestinian prisoners for one Gilad Shalit, and you knew that one of the people that would be released was the mastermind of this operation that took your child, would you have still done it? Would you have been for the deal? And that is and he asked them that. And that I think there's a growing debate inside Israel. It's like at what price on the one hand? And is Israel continuing to create problems for themselves by creating incentives, what appear to be incentives for these kinds of hostage-taking operations? The flip side is there is, rabbinic interpretations that I'm not an expert on, but go back. One of the opinions was written, apparently a 30-page rabbinic opinion by a very senior Sephardic rabbi in Israel that made the case for Israel to risk a lot of lives to do the Entebbe operation in the 1970s, and that undergirds a lot of how Israel makes these decisions, we will make extraordinary concessions to save a Jewish life and return a Jewish life, and it's the ultimate most important thing. I think it's different from this kind of operation, because this is not about what are you going to trade. This is about using military force to get hostages back. And what Nadav pointed out in the conversation is, he said, I thought this was interesting, he said, when the Palestinian telegram channels had all those lies, one of them was 18 Israeli soldiers got killed in this operation. And their point, which was of course absurd, was like, they call this a success. It was a failure. Sure, they got their hostages back, but 18 Israeli soldiers were killed. And he says, it so reveals that they don't understand us, because we would actually risk 18 soldiers' lives to get hostages back. Like that of course it would have been a failure, but it wouldn't have, but they knew they could have lost a lot of lives when they launched this operation, and they did it anyways. I would say on the Shalit deal, going back to 2011, friends of mine so keep in mind that deal was initially considered by Omert, Prime Minister Omert, who was Netanyahu's predecessor, and Omert had a similar deal offered to him, and he turned it down. Tzipi Livni, who was just on my podcast, talked about that. She was foreign minister at the time, and she claims, I mean, it's true though, they turned it down because they saw the list of the Palestinians that Hamas was demanding get released from the prison, and they were like, this is crazy, the people they were going to release. Turns out they were right. Friends of mine who have worked for Netanyahu for years say that is the only decision they've ever really disagreed with him on, was him doing that deal. Now, what Netanyahu has subtly argued over the years was, if you go back in time to 2011, keep in mind that was the time that Netanyahu and others were very seriously considering the reality that Israel may have to go launch a preemptive strike against Iran, and that it could be just a matter of time before Israel's in a war with Iran. And if that were the case, that would be probably the biggest war Israel has been in, I don't know, well, certainly since 2006, the Second Lebanon War, but I don't know, you go much farther back. And they were gonna have to ask a lot of Israelis to really risk their lives and go into enemy territory. And that it was important for Israeli morale to show the lengths Israel would go to get back one soldier at a time when they were contemplating sending a lot of military personnel into enemy territory.
And I think Nadav said it worked, that you could see a palatable change in the soldiers after that deal was
Totally,
done.
he says it was a complete, he says it was a complete morale boost for the military and for society. I mean, and by the way, you saw the same thing during obviously the first hostage deal. Members of the war cabinet have told me that obviously getting back 105 hostages late last year was important on the merits, but it also had the effect of buying the war cabinet a lot of time in this war, because Gallant in particular has said from the beginning, we will only get hostages back in negotiations if Hamas feels that they are under military pressure. And that was the importance of October 7th, or October 8th through kind of basically late November, is Hamas was under enormous military pressure.
So let's talk about October 7th. You always ask your guests on the podcast, I'm gonna ask you, take me back to the moment. What did you hear? What did you realize what was going on? What were your thoughts? You have family, your mother, your sister, your nieces and nephews. What was going on for you on October 7th?
I went to bed late on October 6th, very late. And I will divulge in this crowd that I checked my phone, even though it was Shabbos, the night before I went to bed. And this is off the record. But my mother is here, so she's Shomer Shabbos. But and I started to see stuff. I started to see some reporting out of Israel that seemed weird, but at that point I could still rationalize that it was small. So I felt like, okay, so this is like, May of 21 or summer even of 22, or, you can go back to these kind of little skirmishes between Gaza, between Hamas and Israel. And so I thought maybe it's just that. It was a little odd, like there was a lot of chatter I was seeing, and people like Israeli friends of mine in WhatsApp groups, but obviously I had no idea the scale of it. And I went to sleep and I woke up the next morning, and then obviously I saw that it was something very big was happening. And the test for me for how big, and this is a very unscientific test, the test for me for how big, 'cause it was still morning when I woke up, Saturday, so there's a lot happening. Again, still didn't know the scale of it. So my sister lives in Jerusalem, around the corner from my mother, and in the Emek Rephaim area, and she is Shomer Shabbos, very, very observant, and she made Aliyah in 1994, and since she has lived in Israel, I honestly have not ever spoken to her on the phone on any Shabbat, any of the Chagim. I mean, never, like not once since she moved. I mean, we know that like when we speak, and we're very, I'm very respectful of her, of her schedule, her religious schedule. And I thought, okay, so if this is a really big deal, I have a feeling she'll answer her phone. And it was kind of, I didn't say it, I didn't articulate it to myself at the time that way, but it's like what was happening. And I said, I'll try calling her. And I called her and she answered the phone. And it's like I just had to hear the like click and I knew, okay. And she then told me that she was at services, it was Simchat Torah, she was at services. She was in Jerusalem, so Jerusalem, there was stuff happening, people were being called up, but it wasn't obviously like being far, in Tel Aviv or being, anywhere farther south. She had told me that she was at services and the sirens were going, and someone came into the services synagogue and said, we have to disperse. Everyone must disperse the service. Small Orthodox synagogue near her home. And they said, okay, well, before we go, they made sure to say, the guy, whoever it was telling them they had to get out of there. They made sure to say a blessing for the state of Israel, and then say a blessing for the Israeli soldiers. And then they broke the thing down, and they left. And then she told me she was running home, and she saw something she never sees in Jerusalem, which was men with yarmulkes driving. And then she knew, okay, so these are a lot of religious people who are being called up. I mean, people like in her community in Jerusalem. And so she knew, when on a Shabbat or a Jewish holiday do you see men in yarmulkes driving? Never. And then we spoke a bunch during the day, and then she and I have a friend in common who's in a security role in one of the intelligence units. And the last thing he said to us before the kind of night ended in Israel, and again, that day, I can't remember the numbers, we thought 300, I remember thinking like there was 75 in the morning, but by the end of the day, it was like 300. Disaster, right, 300. And I remember him saying to us, today was terrible, and I think tomorrow is gonna be a much worse day than today. And the reason he said that is because he said there were still so many people unaccounted for. Not to mention there was still fighting going on in many kibbutzim in the south, but he said there were so many people accounted for. They're either hiding, or they're dead, or they've been taken hostage. And so he just thought that as the weekend, as we got into Sunday, they were gonna get a lot of news that was pretty jarring, and he was right.
And then Sunday night, the next day, Chaviv Rettigur is on your podcast. Now, I listened to your podcast, like I said, from the post-corona days. You would occasionally do something about Israel. It wasn't part of your thing.
Yeah.
I had never heard of Chaviv Rettigur. I think now because of you, he's a celebrity, certainly in these circles.
He's insufferable. I mean, the guy, he needs a trailer, he needs a makeup artist, He's like, what's the catering before we record the podcast,
So, first, why Chaviv Rettigur? How did that happen? What were you thinking? And did you realize that this would be your next gig? When did you realize that this would be something?
It's certainly not that weekend. So I did what like many of you did that weekend, which is I just called a lot of people that I know in Israel. Like I just was calling people all weekend long just to see how people were doing. That's all I was doing. And Aviv was one of them. So I called Haviv on Sunday, and I just called him on WhatsApp, and I said, "How you doing? You know, how you holding up?" And he had a lot of neighbors who had family members who'd been taken hostage, and he and his wife was called up for reserves. He has 4 little kids. He's aged out of reserves, but he was called in for some special projects. And then his wife has a number of brothers who were all being called up. It was like chaos on his end. And so on the one hand, he was like living this intensely. And on the other hand, he is this brilliant analyst and historian and observer of Israel. And he just started going. He just started talking and talking and talking. And I said, Haviv, stop, we're recording this. Because it was so powerful. It was this incredible blend of this incredibly rich analysis, which he always does, is provide incredible historical backdrop to his analysis, combined with this raw emotion and soulfulness. It was like all wrapped up in one. I said, we got to record this. If nothing else, this is like a journal almost of your first reactions to what was happening. And he said, no way. And I said, let's record it. Now he knows, he'd been on my podcast a couple times during 2023 about judicial reform, so he knew why I wanted to record him. And he said, no way. I said, yo, let's do this. Let's record it, and then let's just talk. And then if, at the end of it, if you don't want me to post it, I won't post it. But if you're fine with it, then I'm gonna post it. I have not gone back and listened to it. In fact, John Podhoretz from Commentary, John's somewhere, I don't know if John's here.
Right there.
Oh, there's John. So the Sunday night of that weekend, I went on John's podcast. And John, I just heard on his podcast, mentioned the other day that he went back and did something that I've never done. I don't think I can do it. John said he went back and he listened to our podcast from that Sunday night, from the 8th. And again, it made me think, I should go back and listen to this Haviv. That made me think I should go listen to the Haviv. I'm not ready to do that yet. But anyways, I just took that episode and I just posted it, and that was it. And then it really found an audience quickly. So that was that. And then I thought to myself, I'm going to try and record something every day for the next few days. Sometimes I'll record 2 things a day and spread it out. There was so much to cover. And actually, Brett Stevens came over. This was really wild. Brett Stevens came over to our apartment later that day on Sunday to record another episode. And Brett had just come. He said, okay, we'll record something. I'll come to your place. He says, this is really weird. I'm going to go to this rally. Whatever the progressive group in New York, the
Democratic Socialist.
Yeah, Democratic Socialist. Thank you. He goes. I see they're holding a rally in Times Square against Israel. He goes, he was really perplexed by this. Like on October 8th, there's a rally against Israel. So he went to this rally, and then he says, I may write something about this rally.
A rally against us for being victims.
Exactly. He goes, and so he says, there may be this rally. There will be this rally. I don't know what to make of it. I may write something about it, and then I'll come to your place. So Brett comes to my apartment, and he goes, that was the freakiest, fringiest thing. There's no way, I'm not writing about that. He's like, nothing's gonna come of that. He's like, really? He's like, those people are way out, they're so irrelevant, Little did I know that they're representative now of a big chunk of this country's worldview on Israel. And so we recorded something entirely different, all related to October 7th, but not according to that, not about that rally he was at. And then I just started recording stuff every day. Basically what I did is I would talk to Israelis. I tried to talk, I talked to Israelis anyways. Obviously pre-October 7th I talked to Israelis. Certainly post-October 7th I was going to be talking to Israelis. And I figured I'll just talk to Israelis that I know, and I will just post these conversations. And I didn't have a real plan. And I had no idea what kind of audience I would find. I actually thought my audience would shrink a lot, because before that, my podcast covered a range of topics, and I would sprinkle in some Israel, but it wasn't a podcast about Israel.
A lot of U.S. politics.
A lot of U.S. politics, a lot of economics, some market stuff, geopolitics, some sprinkled in a little popular culture. I just assumed if I suddenly flipped to a podcast that was exclusively about Israel, become a very narrow podcast, but it was worth doing, and that's what I plan to do. And then, it kind of.
And then you're consistently now top 30 long-term news podcast, right?
Yeah.
How many listeners do you think?
I don't really know. I try not to get obsessed with the numbers. My producer, Alon Benatar, does. I don't, because I feel like if I'm obsessed with the numbers, it'll affect how I do the conversations. And I just never. My wife, as you know, was a journalist for a number of years. And I have this vivid memory from when she was at CNN, where she was anchoring a show at CNN in the primetime hour. And I remember the show would end at like 9 p.m. By, sometime in the 9 o'clock hour when she was on her way home, she would already have the initial cut of what they would call the minutes from the show, where they would send her the minute to minute to minute of sometimes it was pretty rough on the early side from Nielsen, but they would get the early ratings minute to minute of like everything. And she was expected to analyze those minutes and like get a sense of like, that guest does poorly, this guest does well. Ooh, when you took the conversation in this direction, look, people kind of dropped off. Oh wow, there was real excitement and retention when and it would like completely get in her head. Like she couldn't actually think about having a normal conversation with people because everything was at the minutes, this thing about the minute. The minutes came through. Campbell, have you looked at the minutes yet? Oh my God. And I was like, I just remember the minutes, that's all I would hear about. So I said, I'm not gonna get obsessed with these numbers because I kind of knew what I wanted to do with this podcast. It's not my job. I wasn't like selling ads. I knew what I wanted to do and I was going to do it. So Alon kind of really stays close to it. I can tell you at a high level, we're averaging something, somewhere between, last I checked, 70 to 100,000 downloads per episode. And with a surprising geographic reach, meaning we're popular in the US, UK, Canada, and Australia. We're also really popular in large parts of the Arab world, like Saudi Arabia. And I've learned more about that. And we have the most surprising thing to me. Again, I didn't know to even pay attention to this number before we started, was before October 7th. But what Apple Podcasts measures in doing the rankings is retention. So they measure three things that goes into their algorithm. How many downloads? What is your retention? Meaning how long do people listen to the episode? And then how shareable is it? They can measure when someone listens to something, they're moved by it, they press share and throw it into all their WhatsApp groups. And the retention is like really high, like in the 90s.
So I want to talk
So people are like, my only point about that is, the wake-up call for me there is people are hungry for substance, because some of these episodes are really
thick.
Yes.
Right. And then they're really thick, so if I think so, one thing I didn't mention in your introduction is you're the author of two books, Startup Nation, released in 2009, and Genius of Israel, released in November of this year. When you wrote Startup Nation, obviously the book was a phenomenon, sold all over the world, and really after that, Israel was a startup nation. That was the branding, and nobody in Israel, certainly not the Israelis in Israel, and American Jews, the conflict became not something we cared about, not something we talked about. It was a non-issue. And now, obviously, it's everything, right? The conflict is everything. It's every conversation. It's every story. It's always lurking around. And what I think has been interesting about your podcast is that between Haviva Tikkun and Einat Wilf, and most recently, Tzipi Livni, you get a chance to really learn some history. Have you found that you've learned a lot of? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So what I've learned, and I'll get to your question in a circuitous way. Look, what I've learned through my audience, before I talk about the specific guests, what I've learned through the audience, we basically have, by my lights, what has surprised me about our audience is threefold. One, there is this hunger for dense, what I would think, they're interesting to me, but I would think are pretty boring episodes. A 2-part episode with Benny Morris on like the origins of the 48 War of Independence. I didn't think there'd be a big audience for it. One of our most popular episodes. where it has a long tail. People are still going to it. So there is this hunger for substance. 2, the audience is, again, to my surprise, to the left of me. The audience is to the left of my politics. And that's also pretty interesting. And I've started to see that certain episodes we have kind of take off, and they add a lot of audience to the subscribership, and then they don't leave. So for instance, we had Scott Galloway on, who's a self-described atheist and leftist, not normally my, the kind of people I attract. And he was so, on the one hand, proud and emphatic about his identity as a leftist, while he was outraged by the double standard that Israel is held to, and basically had October 7th was like a wake-up moment for him, to the point that he says in the podcast that this is the cause he's going to devote a lot of his time to, and
At the risk to his audience.
at the risk of his own audience, right? He has this huge audience on his podcast. That he has 2 podcasts. So he has Prof G, which is one podcast. He has this other podcast with Kara Swisher called Pivot. And these are 2 of the biggest podcasts in the tech business world. Very left, pretty left of center crowd. And I had met with Scott. He lives in London right now. But I met with him in London in December, and he started to tell me how freaked out he was, because he also is a professor at NYU, and he goes back and forth. So he was watching what was happening at NYU. He thought it was completely crazy, the anti-Semitism, and so we talked a lot about it. And he said he was going to try to go to Israel. He went to Israel. I heard him on his podcast with Kara Swisher when he got back from Israel, and they started talking about his trip to Israel, and literally 3 minutes into describing his trip to Israel, she was like, yeah, okay, so enough about Israel. And she's like, now let's talk about Apple's earnings, And so she just had zero, and I know she's a very commercial person. She didn't want to lose audience. She didn't want to shed audience. She knows where her audience is. The last thing she wanted to do was Scott go talk about Israel for an hour and have their audience go up in flames. So I recalled him. I was like, Scott, Kara basically, didn't let you get a word on it. Come on my podcast. We can talk Israel all day long. He said, great. He came on, and the number of liberals I know who I've heard from after, and we can see it in the data, but just people reached out to me, including liberal members of Congress who I never hear from about Israel, who reach out and they're like, oh my gosh, that's the one episode I'm going to share with other members of the Democratic caucus.
Jamal Bowman loved it.
Loved it, yeah. He wants swag, he wants call me back merch, right? And he told me, Scott told me he couldn't believe the feedback he had been getting. So that told me there were a lot of people out there who are trying to reconcile their support for Israel, their freak out watching this, the way you put it, sort of that the outrage of the world wasn't directed at the fact that Jews had been massacred, that the outrage of the world was at Jews for objecting to being massacred. So the people were trying to reconcile that view with the fact that they looked around in their liberal circles and they were like, wait a minute. Douglas Murray has this great line that I quote now all the time. I heard him say a few weeks ago, where he said, sometimes there are events in the world where a flame goes up in the sky and it illuminates everything around you. And you look around, you look all around you, and you can, in that flash, see where everybody stands. And he said October 7th was one of those events where the flash went up. You look around, you're like, oh, that's where you stand. Oh, that's where you stand. And that was what Scott was articulating. That flash went up, and he was looking around. He's like, wait a minute, I'm of the left, and none of these. Sheryl Sandberg had the same thing, by the way. I mean, a lot of people and having a space for people somewhere out there. I do it on a podcast, but there are other places where people can talk like that. I just realized there's a big audience for that, and that's great. And then the last thing I would say is, again, wouldn't have expected it. There's this audience for people wanting to understand the conversation happening inside Israel. So last December, I'm in London. That was the trip I saw Scott with. I was there with Aviv Gur. We'd done a couple of events in London, and I get this invitation to go meet with the Saudi ambassador to the UK, who I don't know. His name is Khalid. He's the brother of Princess Rima, who's the Saudi ambassador to Washington, and he's thought of to be like her successor in Washington if she moves up, gets promoted to go back to Riyadh, which is likely. And he's sort of close to MBS. He's a big deal in the kingdom. And so I get this, but I don't know. And I get this invitation to go meet with him. I said, okay. And then they tell me the meetings at the embassy, the Saudi embassy. And these days, if you get an invitation to go to the Saudi embassy, you kind of...
Yeah, good thing you weren't in Turkey.
Yeah. Can I bring a friend? A teddy bear? But I went to the meeting. Everything was fine. And so the two things that were hilarious to me about that meeting. First is, I was like, so by the way, how did you learn I was in town? And I was expecting him to say, like, I had this fantasy that they're like tapping my phones. They're like, how did you know I was in town? He goes, oh, I read about it in the Jewish Chronicle, which is one of the two major London Jewish newspapers. So there was just something about this moment we're in where the Saudi ambassador is like flipping through the Jewish Chronicle on Friday. Rabbi Telushkin's coming next week, okay. And so I said, and then we keep talking, and he's citing different episodes of my podcast. Well, when Haviva Tagore made this point, and he's going on and on. It's like weird. And so I finally said, with all due respect, Ambassador, why are you listening to my podcast? And he said, because it's the only way I can feel like I get a sense for the conversation happening inside Israel. And he says, I can get the official line of the Israeli government that they project to the world. I can read the British and American press coverage of what they think is the conversation happening in Israel. But you have these Israelis on, some you agree with, some you disagree with, some on the right, some from the center, some from the left, journalists, and like I get a sense for the conversation happening inside the country. And by the way, I was in the Persian Gulf early this year. And I was struck when I was going around I was meeting with different government officials in these different countries. And then when you wait in like the holding room, like the ante room before you go into meet with the official, they have TVs on. And in every office you're waiting there, and it's either Al Jazeera or it's like Al Arabiya, depending on what country you're in, different Arab satellite channels. And I would sit there and like on a loop, it was like this incessant coverage of Israeli politics. Like Gantz is doing this, Gallant is doing that, Ben Gvir is, and I was just, so there's this obsession in the Arab world with the intra-Israeli conversation. And that's a whole bunch of reasons why I think that is. And I think there's a big appetite for that here. I would say that, so that's kind of like where the audience is, that's kind of how the interest level of the audience, again, one of the things I could have never planned for. For me, in terms of getting back to your question, a lot of these issues that we deal with, to me, were both settled and boring, right? So like I worked on Capitol Hill for a number of years. If, in the 1990s, back in the 1990s, we were talking about like defunding UNRWA. Like that was like a thing, right? And of course, there were like, 7 senators that were interested in doing anything about it. Like it was just like not a, and there was like this one NGO, what is it, NGO Monitor? Is that the, what's it,
NGO Watch.
NGO Watch, right. And there's another one, UN, I don't know, anyways.
UN Watch.
Thank you, John. UN Watch, NGO Monitors. These are like small 1, 2, and 3 man band NGOs, or, think tanks, whatever you want to call them. They like, their moment had never come, and you just assumed their moment would never come, and there would be philanthropists that would give them a little bit of money every year to kind of send out their newsletters that nobody would read. And it was just like, because these issues, if you actually looked closely at them, they were outrageous, and you knew they were outrageous. But no one seemed to care, and these.
When you say these issues, just...
Well, like the fact that the UN, not to go through the whole, we did 2 episodes. I did one with Einat Wilf and one with Haviva Tagore on this. The UN has a major refugee program for all refugees around the world. And then it has a refugee program for the Palestinians. It's like the most amazing thing that was created.
And the others are all over.
The others are all over, and they're not multi-generational. So like, what's that model's Bella Hadid's, like her father qualifies as a Palestinian refugee from his home in Beverly Hills, California. So that if there's ever a right of return, he gets to participate in the right of return. It's people leave Israel, they have children, they have grandchildren, they all qualify as Palestinian refugees, again, they don't apply the status to any other refugee anywhere in the world.
And that talked about the Koreans.
Right. And so you, don't worry, I'll wait for the applause to pass. And so you just look at the history of these issues and you're like, it is so absurd. And then, oh, by the way, the agency that's running this Palestinian refugee program can't operate in Gaza without being totally in cahoots with Hamas. And the way they'd be totally in is, what does it mean to totally be in cahoots with Hamas? I mean, I'm not laughing because it's sad, and it's honestly like in these stories you see the seeds of destruction of Gaza, and obviously of the catastrophe of October 7th. But you literally have UNRWA, like these UN agency facilities, these refugee facilities that are sitting, the facilities, on top of underground tunnels that are Hamas-built and manned tunnels where like the electricity and the computer connectivity and all the rest goes from the UNRWA facility right down into the Hamas underground tunnel. There's literally no way. Leave aside the UNRWA officials that actually participated in October 7th. That's kind of amazing. But even if you take them out of it, it's unfathomable that these UNRWA officials had no idea what was going on. And it's unfathomable because not only did they not know what was going on, they had intimate knowledge of what was going on. And it wasn't just UNRWA. It was many media organizations and their bureaus. I had Mati Friedman, who's a former AP journalist, on the podcast, talk about just how the media, the international media, operates in Gaza. And the basis for their access and their maneuverability around Gaza is so dependent on them working closely with Hamas. And so, again, we know all these things. And they had become such tired issues, and no one wanted to hear about it. And the tech scene was booming in Israel, and Israel's normalizing with the Persian Gulf countries, and like everything was fine. And the Palestinian issue was kind of passing us by, or we were passing it by. And then suddenly you have an event like October 7th, where you realize, history sort of returns, and then all of a sudden people start examining these issues, and they're like, wait a minute, there's a Palestinian UN agency that operates in coordination with Hamas. Oh, wait, there's a Venn diagram where there are some employees of UNRWA who actually we know participated in October 7th, and and people start seeing this for the first time because they never really thought about it, and they're horrified. They're like, how does this happen? And I have a lot of friends, I'm sure you do too, who are stumbling upon these issues for the first time, and they're like, so for them, these episodes that provide all this history are like gold, because a lot of people, for the first time, are getting an education.
All right, so I want to get to Q&A, but I want to ask you, so 1 minute on each now. U.S. politics, what are the implications? Israeli politics, what are the implications? Day after, go.
What are the implications for U.S. politics or of U.S. politics?
For U.S. politics, what do you think is going to happen? What's going to happen in November?
If the election were held today, I think Trump would win, and I think the Republicans would win the Senate majority, and I don't know what would happen in the House. It's a coin toss.
And what does that mean for Israel?
And by the way, a lot can change obviously between now and November, although it's getting, it's getting pretty late for things to change, but they could change. Look, normally, one would say, when you're considering a future administration, a possible new administration's policies towards Israel or any foreign policy, you would either look to how that person, let's say that person was a senator or whatever, how they approach that issue when they're in the Senate, or you would look at, in this case, if they're a former president, you would look at how they served as president and their policies when they were previously in office. Obviously with Trump, it's a little different, a little more, shall we say, volatile and harder to predict. But even with his, and obviously things are so personal to him, and he has this very personal resentment towards Netanyahu because he had the gall to congratulate Joe Biden when he won the election in 2020. So like there's all this weird stuff. But I keep coming back to this. Again, I'm not making a value judgment on Donald Trump, but just as a pure political and policy analysis from a pure policy analysis standpoint, Trump was among the most pro-Israel presidents in history. If you look at everything from the energy, the political capital him and his team expended on the Abraham Accords, to the taking out Soleimani from Iran, to ranking up sanctions on Iran, to moving the embassy to Jerusalem, to dealing with the Golan Heights. I mean, I can go on and on and on. It's very supportive of Israel. Based on that alone, one would say he would most certainly have Israel's back and give Israel the time and space to do what it needed to do. When you add on to that, if you look at Trump's time in office, he enjoys being president. I don't think he actually enjoys the domestic and foreign policy making job of being president, which is sort of a weird thing if you want to be president. Those are kind of two of the more important things. And so when the Republicans had the majority in the first 2 years of his administration, he outsourced most of his domestic policy, really all of it, and economic policy, to Paul Ryan, who was Speaker, and Mitch McConnell, who was Senate Majority Leader. And then over time, he outsourced a lot of his foreign policy, big foreign policy work, to people like Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley for a time, Jared Kushner. And so he really defers to his people. And the nature of this kind of work is presidents can make grand pronouncements, but there's a lot of work that gets done at the interagency process. And if you defer a lot to those people, they are going to effectively be making policy. And if you just assume he's going to appoint more people like he appointed when he was president, I think if he's president, Israel should be fine. What were the other two?
Yeah, let's go to Q&A. So, fire away, Chuck.
So, in the world of local domestic media, what's your perception of how the media has been covering the Israel Gaza business? All the stuff you just said related to, before 18 days, 18 days, whatever. Just where are things landed in your perception, and what is the
You mean of how crazy the media coverage has been?
Correct.
Yeah. So obviously I feel naive because it's so much worse than I thought it would be. I mean, every day it's like one insane thing after the other, not the least of which is the idea that the news out of last weekend was that quote unquote 234 Palestinians were killed. Yeah, so I've been, my only point is I'm shocked by it, and I haven't fully processed it. My instinct initially was a combination of Israel is always held to a different standard, and the Israelis are really bad at PR and communications. So, I've talked for years, I'm not the only one who've talked to Israeli leaders and decision makers for years about ways to improve their communications. Part of it is, in fairness, structural. It's a bureaucratic disaster how they make communications decisions. I won't bore you with this now, but most of the communications decisions happen in the Army spokesperson's office. The Army spokesman, who's usually it always is a general, a one-star general who reports directly to the Army Chief of Staff, and they have like their own orbit, and like they don't really. It's like a real division of labor and a bureaucrat. I mean, they don't, like the Prime Minister's office, and even the Defense Minister doesn't have total oversight over it, and so still have left hand not talking to the right hand, which impedes the ability to move quickly on things. It's like total chaos. They're not going to solve this bureaucratic mess in the middle of a war. A. B. Israelis have always put a low priority on media communications, even in wartime. When I would talk to Israelis about ways to improve overall how they're structured to deal with communications, they had zero interest in listening. They looked at me the way, like, the only analogy, they like look at me like trying to talk to someone about their cholesterol when they're in the middle of a knife fight. It's like, let me tell you about your cholesterol level. And they're like, I'm getting stabbed right now, and like, let me beat back this guy who's trying to kill me with a knife, and then we can talk about my cholesterol. And they view like dealing with PR about dealing with your cholesterol. And so they never made it a priority. But the bigger problem, and the one that's the most difficult to wrestle with, is there are some journalists who I genuinely believe are operating in good faith. There are. And actually what I try to do with my podcast is try to reach a lot of those people. These are not people who are natural cheerleaders for Israel, but they also, the people I'm thinking of, but they're not, as I'm talking about it, but they're not people who wake up every day hostile to Israel. And so what I try to do with my podcast, if I have to take a step back and say, like, what am I doing? I'm trying to present the dilemmas and challenges that Israel is faced with. And I'm trying to present those challenges and those dilemmas to people who are, again, maybe skeptical of Israel, maybe critical of Israel, but at least are doing what they're doing in good faith. The problem is there's a whole bunch of other people who aren't operating in good faith. And I keep coming back to the fact that about every 80 to 100 years, we have a major wave of anti-Semitism in the world. And that anti-Semitism is not a result of if only the Jews had better communications, and only if the Jews told their story better. I've been referencing this book in my podcast because I've been rereading it, which is chilling to read now, called The Pity of It All, which is so relevant to, well, how people are nodding, which is so relevant to this moment. It's about the history of German Jewish life from the mid 1700s to 1933. And it's eerie, but as you watch these Jews who had this incredible influence and power in Berlin, and incredible influence, they were the heads of the hospitals, they were the heads of the universities, they were heads of the merchant banks, they were the heads of, really it's chilling to see the parallels. And then everyone, obviously, everyone really turned on them, including their neighbors, including the civic heads of the different organizations they were working with, including their business colleagues. Everyone turned on them. And it wasn't because they didn't tell their story well. And it wasn't because if only they could get their PR better. And so this is the story of us. And you can type in the word anti-Semitism in any century you want and put it into Google, and it'll shock you what you will see. Type in anti-Semitism in the 10th century. Type in anti-Semitism in the 18th century. What you will see will blow your mind. And those aren't a function of if only the Jews had told their story better. And what I'm realizing, which is why I don't have a good answer to your question, is for a lot of the people we're dealing with, it's not a function of if only Israel and the Jews told their story better. There's something deeper going on.
I'm interested in your view. Just from what I see, it looks like this current US administration actually hinders Israel. That's just my perception, and I hear Anthony Blinken.
So
what is your view?
the question is the current US administration hindering Israel from getting the job done?
In one word, yes. And that wasn't always the case. I thought the first few months of this war, the U.S. administration was extraordinary, and I said that all the time. U.S. president flies to Israel on Air Force One, sits at the war cabinet, making clear to the world whose side he's on. Deploys enormous military assets to the region, provides an endless supply of armaments and munitions to Israel. Really, I can go on and on and on. Early on, vetoed bad resolution after bad resolution at the UN Security Council, gave a series of very powerful speeches. I think that, combined with the fact that Israel was exerting enormous military pressure against Hamas in the first few months, combined with the fact that we hadn't had the full crazy on U.S. campuses and elsewhere in those first few months. There was some of it, but it was nothing like we've seen over the last couple months. You didn't have all these, European countries, starting to recognize a Palestinian state, country after country saying they're going to suspend all arms sales to Israel. So it was just a different period, and I think the message to Hamas was the pressure was mounting on Hamas. The pressure wasn't mounting on Israel. And I think that was when Hamas was most vulnerable. That was when Hamas was willing to do a big deal for 7 days. Think about that. They gave up 105 hostages for 7 days of quiet. Not even a permanent ceasefire. 7 days of quiet. If you fast forward to now, almost everything has changed. Obviously, you have the craziness going on here on the campuses, and I point to the campuses, and people say to me, "Oh, it's a trivial thing. You're over." Nonsense. You literally have Al Qaeda, and you have or whatever the Al Qaeda 2.0, and you have the Iranian government issuing statements of, and Hezbollah issuing statements of solidarity with these college kids in the U.S., which is wake up, kids, And so the stuff happening on the campuses, combined with what's been happening at the UN, which is bad resolutions being passed and the US more or less not vetoing them or green lighting them through abstentions. And then you have the US administration making a bunch of really strong statements critical of Israel, and in some cases the president saying he's going to suspend offensive arms, whatever that means, offensive arms, but he'd let Israel keep their defensive capabilities, whatever. Again, Israel's fighting a defensive war. Like, it was like such a weird formulation. Israel's fighting a defensive war, but we'll only let them keep their defensive, anyways. And so you add all these things up, and country after country saying they're going to suspend armaments sales. And I think if you're Senor, if you're sitting there in some tunnel in Gaza, you're like, wait a minute, the pressure's mounting on Israel, it's not mounting on us. Why would we give now? In fact, if you read these quotes from this most recent Wall Street Journal report, he basically says just that. And so I think in that sense, the breach between the US and Israel is very dangerous. I mean, you go back, I can't remember, it was like basically from March through April, when you had a series of events. You had the State of the Union address, which I thought President Biden used for the first time, really, some very damaging language about Israel. You had Senator Schumer go to the Senate floor and talk about Israel like it was a banana republic, that he from the Senate floor in Washington was going to like topple the Israeli government. And where he equated as obstacles to peace both the Israeli government and Hamas, as though they were like on an equal plane. And then you had this UN vote that the US abstained on, and then you fast forward to Biden talking about suspending arms. I just think you add all those things up, and that's when Hamas, I thought, really started to dig in on all these negotiations and not make any concessions. So I think it's very damaging. That said, as critical as I am, and as critical as you hear me, I would be remiss if I did not say the following. We are 8 months into this. This is the longest war Israel has fought since the War of Independence. Except for this quote-unquote suspension of offensive arms for a brief period. It turns out it wasn't even really a suspension, and it was like the whole implementation of it, what didn't actually happen. I think it had a damaging message to Hamas that the US was going to do it, but in reality, didn't have any practical impact on Israel's war-fighting capability. The US is still providing all these arms. Like, the President of the United States has so far not said, clearly, Israel stop. Like, I would have thought 8 months in, really, and he's a Democratic president who's in a tough re-election. I'm not giving him a pass. I'm just saying I'm genuinely surprised that we are 8 months in and we have an administration that has all these characters in it that are clearly hate US policy as it relates to Israel, and is still basically letting Israel fight its war. Now, one thing that has helped Israel is Israel has proved wrong almost every US prediction. The US predicted that Israel would experience about 10 times the casualties it has experienced, comparing this to some kind of experience that we had in Iraq and Afghanistan, which has not been true. They told Israel to take the win after the incredible defense against the Iranian missiles. In fact, Israel responded, and the way Israel responded was extremely important. The language of take the win reminds me of what this, what they would have thought of Israel doing this operation just now, or what from last weekend, how risky it was, or the operation to Rafah more generally, where they were pushing back. You can't do it. Never in the history of modern warfare has any military moved this many civilians. It's going to take months. It's going to take 3 months. It's going to take 4 months. It's impossible. It took 10 days. They moved 900,000 people in 10 days. So I do think Israel has gotten more self-confident in proving the U.S. wrong. And so I'm cautiously optimistic about the U.S.-Israel situation, but I do think it has caused problems.
All right, Dan, first I want to say, of my friends, Dan's the more positive one. If you want to really hear about anti-Semitism, please hang around. John Podhoretz will be our next speaker.
He'll be the rebuttal. John will be the rebuttal.
Dan, I hope we can count on you again next year.
All right.
All right, thank you all. Thank you.